15-year-old daughter uses a wheelchair. She was rolling down the sidewalk on a nice spring day, heading to the small park at the end of our street. She loves feeling the warm wind and waving hello to everyone. It was a calm and happy day. Then Karen from the HOA sneaked into our open garage the night before. She used big garden scissors to cut the brake lines on Emily's wheelchair. She wanted to teach us a lesson because the wheelchair was sometimes left near the driveway. She said it made the neighborhood look bad. The next day, Emily tried the brakes as she rolled down a little hill toward the park. The brakes did not work at all. The chair went faster and faster. She shouted for help as it sped straight toward the busy street. Her scared eyes looked everywhere for someone to save her. Karen stood at her window across the street and smiled in a mean way. Now she'll learn to keep that thing hidden, she said to herself. She looked very proud. She did not know the tall man in uniform running fast from the big county police building nearby was my daughter's father, a deputy commissioner of the state police. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. Spring arrived quietly, the way it always did in this neighborhood, without announcements, without permission, simply showing up one morning as if it had always been there. The air felt warmer, lighter, the long winter shadows had pulled back, and in their place came sunlight that spilled across the sidewalks like something generous and kind. Emily noticed it right away. She always did. She adjusted the sleeves of her hoodie as she rolled out of the driveway, letting the breeze brush across her face. The world felt open today, fresh, alive. The small park at the end of the street waited for her the way it always had, with its familiar bench, the old oak tree, and the soft hum of life moving at its own pace. Her wheelchair glided smoothly along the pavement, its quiet rhythm almost musical. Emily loved that sound. It meant freedom. It meant motion. It meant she was going somewhere because she chose to. As she passed the Johnsons' house, Mrs. Johnson waved from her porch. Emily waved back, her smile automatic and bright. A little farther down, a man walking his dog nodded politely. The dog barked once, tail wagging wildly, and Emily laughed under her breath. She loved days like this. Days when nothing felt rushed. Days when the world felt friendly. Days when she could just exist without explanations, or stares or whispered comments. The neighborhood looked different in spring, softer, kinder. Even the houses seemed less sharp around the edges, as though the sunlight had decided to forgive them for their rigid lines and strict rules. Flower beds had been freshly planted, lawns trimmed to perfection. Everything was in its place. Everything always had to be in its place here. Emily didn't think about that much, though. She thought about the wind, about how it carried the smell of grass and distant flowers, about how the sky looked impossibly blue, like it had been painted just for her. Behind her, the garage door stood open. Her father had left it that way while sorting through some tools earlier that morning. He'd promised he would close it later. He always did. Emily didn't worry about it. She trusted the world more than most people thought she should. She rolled a little faster, enjoying the gentle slope of the sidewalk. Not fast enough to be reckless, just enough to feel the thrill of movement, the way the ground seemed to stretch ahead of her, inviting rather than warning. Across the street, curtains shifted slightly in a front window. Emily didn't notice. She was too busy waving to Mr. Patel, who was sweeping his driveway with slow, careful movements. He smiled back warmly. Emily smiled wider. Moments like these mattered to her. They were proof that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Nothing felt wrong. The street was quiet, peaceful. Birds hopped along the grass. Somewhere a lawnmower started up and then stopped again. The sounds blended together into something comforting and ordinary. Perfectly ordinary, yet beneath that calm something sat just out of sight, something small, something easy to miss, the kind of thing that didn't announce itself or demand attention, the kind of thing that waited. Emily slowed slightly as the sidewalk curved, her hands resting easily where they always did. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the promise of the day ahead. The park was close now, just a little farther, behind her, in the open garage. Sunlight reflected off metal that looked unchanged, untouched, exactly where it was supposed to be. And sometimes that's how danger hides best, not loud, not obvious, not cruel in ways you can see right away. Sometimes it hides inside a day that feels perfect, waiting for someone to notice before it's too late. Emily's father didn't usually stop in the garage. It was just a habit, really. Walk past, grab his keys, remind himself to close the door later. That morning should have been no different. The day was already moving forward, coffee cooling on the counter, Emily chatting about the park, the quiet rhythm of an ordinary morning, yet his steps slowed. He couldn't explain why at first. There was no noise, no movement, nothing visibly wrong. But years in law enforcement had trained him to respect instincts that spoke without words, the kind that nudged instead of shouted. He turned back. Sunlight streamed into the garage, catching on familiar shapes, shelves, tools, boxes stacked neatly along the wall. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Too exactly. His eyes settled on Emily's wheelchair. It sat where she had left it the night before, angled slightly toward the driveway. Clean, ready, normal. He told himself that was all it was. Still, he walked closer. The air felt different there, cooler somehow. Or maybe that was just him. He crouched slightly, his gaze scanning details he'd seen hundreds of times before. Wheels, frame, cables. Then he saw it. A cable didn't lie the way it should have, not frayed, not broken, just wrong, shifted, touched. His heartbeat changed immediately. This wasn't wear and tear. This wasn't time or weather or accident. It was too precise, too intentional. The kind of adjustment made by hands, not chance. He straightened slowly, every sense sharpening. "Emily," he called calmly, keeping his voice steady. "Hold on a second, okay?" She paused at the doorway, still smiling. "What's up, Dad?" "Just want to check something," he said. He forced a casual tone, the kind that didn't alarm. He'd learned long ago that panic spread faster than truth. He knelt again and gently tested the brakes. They responded, but not the way they should, not not reliably, enough to stop a chair on flat ground, not enough for anything more. His hand tightened around the frame. Someone had been here. The thought landed heavily, not as fear, but as certainty. The garage door had been open late the night before. He remembered now, remembered meaning to close it and getting distracted by a phone call, a mistake. His mind began working through possibilities with trained precision. Who had access? Who complained? Who watched too closely? Who had crossed lines before and smiled while doing it? Across the street, a house stood quiet and perfectly maintained. He didn't look at it yet. Instead, he stood and walked back to Emily, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to the park just yet," he said gently. She tilted her head. "Why? Did I forget something?" "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "I did." He didn't explain further. Not yet. She trusted him, and that trust mattered more than answers in that moment. He rolled the wheelchair back into the garage himself, slower than necessary, as though time could be stretched if he treated it carefully enough. Once inside, he closed the door fully. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. He took out his phone. Not for emergency lights, not for sirens. Just quiet messages, quiet checks, quiet confirmations, the kind that happened before anyone else knew there was a problem. Emily watched him from the kitchen table, her smile fading into curiosity. "Am I in trouble?" she asked lightly. He looked at her and smiled back. "No, you're safe." The words came easily because they were true. For now, outside, the street remained peaceful. Neighbors went about their routines. The park waited at the end of the sidewalk, unchanged and unaware. And somewhere nearby, someone believed they had done something small enough not to be noticed. They were wrong, because so. People are trained to notice exactly the things no one else sees. And once you notice them, you don't look away. Across the street, Karen stood very still. The curtains in her living room were drawn just enough to leave a narrow gap, a thin slice of the outside world framed by carefully pressed fabric. From there, she could see everything that mattered, or at least everything she believed mattered. She always stood in this exact spot, every morning, every afternoon, every time something felt even slightly out of place. Watching had become second nature to her. It wasn't curiosity, she told herself. It was responsibility. Someone had to care about the rules. Someone had to notice when standards slipped, when appearances declined, when people forgot what kind of neighborhood this was supposed to be. Her eyes moved automatically to the driveway across the street. The wheelchair. It had been there again last night. She was certain of it, angled too close to the edge of the driveway. Visible, obvious, impossible to ignore if you cared about things like property values and community image. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't hate the girl, she told herself. That would sound cruel. What she hated was disorder. What she hated was accommodation becoming expectation. What she hated was how one exception always led to another, until rules stopped meaning anything at all. Rules were supposed to be firm. Rules were supposed to apply to everyone. She had made that clear. More than once, emails had been sent, carefully worded at first, then less so. Complaints filed through the HOA portal, complete with timestamps and photographs. She had even printed copies highlighting key phrases in yellow. just in case anyone tried to say she hadn't warned them. Warnings mattered to Karen. They were proof that she was reasonable. From behind the curtain, she watched Emily roll out onto the sidewalk, sunlight catching in her hair. The girl waved at someone down the street, smiling like there was nothing wrong at all. Karen scoffed quietly. That smile irritated her more than she cared to admit. It felt undeserved, too easy, as if the world should simply adjust itself without question. Her gaze flicked to the garage. Open again. Of course it was. Karen felt a familiar spark of satisfaction. She had known they wouldn't listen. People like that never did. They thought rules were flexible, that exceptions could be made permanent. They thought sympathy replaced structure. She adjusted the curtain slightly, angling for a better view. She was waiting for proof, for confirmation, for the moment when she could say, "See, this is exactly what I was talking about." But the moment didn't come the way she expected. Emily slowed, then stopped. Karen leaned closer to the glass. The father appeared in the frame next, his posture different now, alert, focused. He crouched near the wheelchair, his movements careful, deliberate, not confused, not careless. Karen's satisfaction faltered. She watched as he tested something. Once, then again. The easy rhythm of the morning shifted, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. His face changed, the warmth draining from it like light pulled behind clouds. Karen felt a flicker of unease. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He said something to Emily. Karen couldn't hear the words, but she saw the girl nod. The wheelchair was turned back toward the garage. Slowly, purposefully, Karen's fingers curled against the fabric of the curtain. "No," she muttered under her breath. This wasn't right. The day was supposed to prove her point. It was supposed to show what happened when people ignored rules and let things slide. Instead, the garage door began to close. The sound carried faintly across the street, a final unmistakable click. Karen stepped back from the window, irritation rising sharply in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing. Probably just another delay, another excuse. People were always making excuses. Still, she returned to the window a moment later. This time she noticed the father's phone. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't texting casually. He was making calls. Karen's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected anything beyond mild embarrassment. Maybe a forced apology, maybe another complaint brushed aside by the HOA board like so many before it. She told herself she was overreacting. After all, she had only ever tried to protect the neighborhood. And yet, as she watched from behind the safety of her curtains, a quiet thought crept in. One she didn't like, one she pushed away immediately. Some people didn't see rules the way she did. Some people enforced different ones. And for the first time since she'd taken it upon herself to manage the street, Karen wondered, briefly, uneasily, whether she had finally watched the wrong house a little too closely. The investigation didn't announce itself. There were no flashing lights on the street, no whispered rumors at first, no neighbors gathering behind curtains the way they usually did when something exciting or scandalous happened. Instead, it moved quietly, with purpose, slipping into place like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be solved. Emily's father made sure of that. By mid-morning, the garage was no longer just a garage. It was a controlled space. Photographs were taken, measurements noted, every detail recorded with the kind of precision that came from years of knowing exactly how small things told big stories. The wheelchair remained untouched, not because it was fragile, but because the truth was. Across the street, Karen went about her routine. She watered her plants. She checked. Hit her email. She drafted yet another message to the HOA board about long-standing compliance issues and continued disregard for neighborhood standards. She felt calm, satisfied, even. Whatever delay had happened that morning, she told herself it was temporary. People like that always scrambled when confronted. They always tried to fix things quietly, hoping no one noticed their mistakes. Karen noticed everything. What she didn't notice was the way quiet cars rolled through the neighborhood later that day, the way doors opened and closed without ceremony, the way conversations happened just out of earshot. She didn't notice the neighbors who reviewed their security footage after a polite request, or the timestamps that lined up too neatly to ignore, or the angle of a shadow crossing a driveway long after midnight. She certainly didn't notice the garden shears missing from her shed. By late afternoon, a clear picture had begun to form. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. There were patterns, complaints filed with increasing frequency, language that shifted from concern to fixation, emails that repeated the same phrases again and again, as if typing them often enough would turn opinion into authority. There were photographs too, close-ups of the driveway, of the garage, of the wheelchair, captured from across the street, framed carefully as evidence of a problem that existed only in one person's mind. And then there was the footage. The garage camera showed movement that didn't belong. A figure stepping just inside the threshold, hands reaching where they shouldn't. The pause, long enough to mean intention, not curiosity. The footage never showed a face clearly. It didn't have to. Karen received the call just before dinner. The number was unfamiliar but official sounding. She answered with practiced confidence, her voice warm, polite, cooperative. She assumed. This was about the HOA, perhaps a question, perhaps even an apology for not taking her complaints seriously enough. She smiled as she listened. Yes, of course, she said. I'm happy to come in. I've always believed in cooperation. The building she walked into later was larger than she expected. More formal, less forgiving. Still, she held her head high. This was what responsible citizens did. They showed up. They explained themselves. They trusted the system to recognize who was right. Karen sat in the waiting area with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She glanced around, taking in the framed photographs on the walls, the muted colors, the quiet efficiency of the space. She felt important being there. Necessary. When the door finally opened, she stood quickly, smoothing her jacket. Her smile faltered, only for a moment, but long enough. The man who stepped forward wasn't an HOA representative. He wasn't a volunteer board member or a mediator with a clipboard. He was someone who carried authority without raising his voice, someone whose presence shifted the air in the room, grounding it, sharpening it. She recognized him then. The father, Emily's father. Her smile disappeared completely. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't need to. He simply gestured for her to sit and placed a folder on the table between them. Inside were printouts, emails, photographs, time-stamped footage, each piece laid out carefully, methodically, without drama. Karen opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time, she couldn't find the right words. The rules she had clung to so tightly, her version of them at least, no longer applied here. This wasn't about appearances. This wasn't about neighborhood standards. This was about boundaries and consequences. The room remained quiet as the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. Outside, the neighborhood car. Right on as usual. Lawns trimmed, driveways clean, everything still in its place. But something fundamental had shifted, because power, when it meets accountability, doesn't shout. It simply closes the door and asks you to explain yourself. News didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, like it often did in this neighborhood, through half-heard conversations, unanswered emails, and the sudden absence of familiar authority figures. At first, people only noticed what wasn't happening. The HOA bulletin board stayed blank. The weekly reminder emails didn't arrive. No warnings about trash bins, no notices about driveway violations, no passive-aggressive messages about maintaining community standards for the first time in years. The neighborhood was silent. That silence didn't last. Someone noticed official cars parked near the community office late one afternoon. Someone else mentioned that 2 HOA board members had resigned effective immediately. A third neighbor quietly confirmed that a meeting scheduled for Thursday night had been canceled without explanation. By Friday morning, everyone was talking. They spoke in lowered voices at first, at mailboxes, over hedges, across driveways, the kind of conversations that started with, "I probably shouldn't say this, but," and ended with wide eyes and shaking heads. Karen's name came up again and again, not in the way she was used to. People remembered things differently now. The complaints that had once seemed merely annoying suddenly felt excessive. The photos she'd taken, the notes she'd left, the way she stood just a little too close during friendly reminders, patterns emerged once people started looking for them. The story became clear by the hour, sharpened by official statements that said just enough to confirm what everyone already suspected. There had been an investigation. It involved misconduct. It involved a serious violation of trust. It involved a line that should never have been crossed. When the truth finally settled into place, it changed the way people looked at everything. The driveway across the street wasn't out of compliance anymore. The open garage wasn't careless. The wheelchair wasn't an inconvenience. It was a part of a family's daily life. And the neighborhood realized, collectively and uncomfortably, that they had watched one person complain loudly while another family lived quietly under scrutiny. Emily noticed the change immediately. Neighbors waved longer now. They stopped to talk. They asked how she was doing and waited for the answer. Someone brought over baked goods without saying why. Another neighbor offered to install better lighting near the sidewalk just in case. A retired couple at the corner began sitting outside in the afternoons, keeping an easy, watchful presence that felt protective rather than controlling. The park felt different too. It wasn't just a destination anymore, it was a shared space again. Children played, adults lingered, conversations stretched out instead of cutting short. People looked out for one another. At an emergency HOA meeting held weeks later, run by an interim board and attended by more residents than ever before, rules were discussed carefully, not as weapons, not as tools for power, but as guidelines meant to serve real people, living real lives. Someone stood up and spoke about compassion. Someone else talked about accountability. Another person mentioned that rules without empathy weren't rules at all. They were excuses. No one mentioned Karen by name. They didn't have to. Her house stayed quiet. The curtains remained drawn, but this time, no one felt watched by them. The authority she once carried had dissolved completely, replaced by an understanding that oversight without humanity had no place here. Emily rolled down the sidewalk one afternoon, heading toward the park once again. She felt the eyes on her, but they were different now. Softer, respectful, familiar. The neighborhood no longer saw her wheelchair as something that disrupted order. They saw it as a reminder that safety mattered more than appearances. That community meant protection, not punishment. That rules existed to serve people, not control them. As Emily reached the park, she paused for a moment, looking back at the street lined with houses that finally felt like homes instead of checkpoints. Spring sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like it truly belonged to everyone who lived there. A week later, the sidewalk looked exactly the same. That was the strange part. The concrete hadn't changed. The cracks were still there, winding their familiar paths like quiet signatures of time. The oak tree at the corner still leaned slightly to the left. The park bench still faced the street, worn smooth by years of use. And yet everything felt different. Emily rolled out of the garage slowly, not because she had to, but because she wanted to take it in. The door closed behind her with a solid, reassuring sound. The wheelchair moved smoothly beneath her hand, steady and responsive, just the way it was meant to be. She tested the brakes once, firm, reliable, safe. Her father watched from the driveway, arms crossed, eyes alert, but softer now. He nodded to her, not as permission, but as reassurance, the kind that said, "I'm here. I'm always watching. You're not alone." Emily smiled and headed down the sidewalk. The morning air was warm without being heavy, carrying the scent of grass and fresh flowers. Somewhere nearby, a radio played faintly. Wind chimes rang from a porch farther down the street, their sound light and uneven, like laughter that didn't need an audience. As Emily rolled past the first house, Mrs. Johnson waved, both hands this time. Not the polite gesture from before, but an enthusiastic one that made Emily laugh out loud. A few doors down, Mr. Patel raised his coffee cup in greeting. The dog she liked so much bounded toward the fence, tail wagging so hard its whole body followed. People noticed her now, not because she stood out, but because they wanted to. Halfway to the park, Emily spotted something new. Fresh flowers rested near the bench under the oak tree. Simple ones, yellow and white, no card, no explanation. Just there, bright against the green grass. She slowed, feeling something warm settle in her chest. At the park, a small group of neighbors lingered, not hovering, not watching too closely, just present. Someone had brought a pitcher of lemonade and set it on the bench with a few paper cups. "For anyone," a woman said quickly, as if afraid to make a fuss. "It's warm today." Emily thanked her and took a cup. The cool sweetness a welcome contrast to the sun. She looked around the park. The familiar space now layered with something new, care, understanding, a sense of shared responsibility that didn't feel heavy or controlling. She remembered how the park had felt before, like a destination she reached on her own, a place she loved, but also one she had to earn by navigating glances and unspoken judgments. Now, it felt like it belonged to her in a different way. It belonged to everyone. Across the street, one house stayed quiet, curtains drawn, no movement, no watching eyes. Emily noticed it briefly, then let the thought go. Whatever had lived there before, control, resentment, entitlement, it no longer had power over her day. She turned her face toward the sun instead. Her father arrived a few minutes later, walking instead of running this time. He sat on the bench beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "Good day?" he asked. "The best," Emily said without hesitation. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood being exactly what it was supposed to be, a place where people lived, imperfectly, but together. Later, as Emily prepared to head home, she took one last look at the park, the flowers, the bench, the open space that felt lighter now. Spring hadn't changed the neighborhood on its own. People had, by paying attention, by stepping in when something felt wrong, by choosing empathy over control. Emily rolled back toward home with an easy rhythm, her hands steady, her smile unguarded. The sidewalk carried her smoothly, faithfully. All the way back, behind her, the park remained, quiet, welcoming, and safe, and ahead of her stretched something even better than a perfect day. A community that had finally learned what truly mattered.